In a small African village, hidden amongst green hills and fields stretching to the horizon, lived an 11-year-old girl named Amina. She was the daughter of a woman named Naima, who had raised her alone since she was born. Amina's father had died when she was very young, and her mother had taken over all of her daughter's care. Naima was a strong woman, respected in the village, and many admired her ability to support her family and run the household. Amina grew up amidst traditions and customs that were passed down from generation to generation. From childhood, she helped her mother around the house, went to the market with her, and participated in all the village festivities. Her long black hair, which she often braided into neat pigtails, and large dark eyes attracted the attention not only of the locals, but also of the visiting traders. But Amina was not only beautiful. She possessed a lively mind and was inquisitive, which was not always welcome in her society. Her mother, Naima, often said,
Amina, you must be careful with your dreams. The world outside our village is not as simple as it seems.
Amina usually listened to her mother, but there was a dream in her heart that she never told anyone. The girl dreamed of seeing the world beyond her village, of finding out what was out there, beyond the hills she had heard so much about. She was drawn to the stories of the traders who came to the village from faraway places. Every time she heard of the marvelous towns, where the houses were built of stone instead of clay, her heart sank. However, despite her dreams, Amina always respected her mother and understood her concern. Naima brought up her daughter in strict traditions, teaching her to honor her elders, follow the rules and be loyal to her family. They lived in a small house on the edge of the village, where in the mornings the sun would softly illuminate their humble dwelling through the thatched roof. Mother and daughter often spent evenings together, sitting by the hearth as they prepared a simple but hearty meal. In such moments, Naima would share stories of the past with Amina, telling her about her father, how they had built this house together and dreamed of a future he sadly never saw. One evening, when the scarlet sun was almost hidden behind the horizon and the calm around the village had spread, Amina decided to talk to her mother about her dreams. They sat next to the hearth, and the fire cast shadows on their faces.
Mother, have you ever thought about what it might be like outside our village?
Amina asked, looking at her mother with slight worry. Naima smiled, but a slight shadow of worry was reflected in her eyes.
My daughter, the world outside our village is very large and full of dangers. I understand your wishes, but we are safe here in our village. This is our home, where we are known and respected.
Amina nodded, but there was still a feeling in her heart that she was meant for something more than just following tradition and living like her ancestors. She wanted to see the ocean that one of the traders had told her about. She wanted to walk the streets of big cities, to hear other languages and learn how people in other places lived. Despite her curiosity, Amina was an obedient daughter and understood what her mother was telling her out of care and love. She often reflected on her mother's words, weighing her desires and responsibilities to her family. The village in which they lived was a small but very close-knit community. Everyone knew each other, and the villagers often helped each other in times of need. For example, if someone got sick or needed help in the field, neighbors would come to the rescue. In this world, there were traditions and customs that were respected by everyone without exception. Girls of Amina's age were already preparing for marriage, which, as a rule, was arranged by the parents by mutual agreement. For Amina, however, marriage seemed distant and alien. Her mother had told her about the importance of family ties and responsibility to the family, but Amina was not yet ready for such a step. One of Amina's closest friends was a peer named Kaba. They had grown up together since childhood, and although Kaba was a boy, they often played and went to school together. As they grew older, their friendship became more than just childish fun. Keba respected Amina's dreams and often supported her in her aspirations.
Amina, if I could, I would go with you to the big world.
Keba once said as they sat on a hilltop watching the sun set over the horizon. Amina smiled.
I know, Keba, but we have to respect our parents and their decisions. Maybe one day we can fulfill our dreams, but for now we are here in our village, and this is our...
Keba nodded, but in his eyes he read the same dream that Amina had. They both realized that their lives were bound up with tradition and obligations to their families, but their young hearts were yearning for freedom and new discoveries. Amina was known among the villagers for her kind heart and willingness to help. She was often seen at the market helping her mother sell crops, or in the fields, gathering herbs for cooking. Her smile and kindness attracted people, and she was a favorite of the village elders. One day, during one of these conversations, an elder named Baka, who was a friend of her late father, said to her, "Amina, you are a special girl. You will bring your family much joy. Listen to your heart, but don't forget who you are and where you come from." These words were seared into her soul, and she thought about them often. Her heart was full of dreams, but she knew her journey would not be easy. Many trials awaited her, and she had to choose between her duty to her family and her own desires. The next day, when the sun was just beginning to rise over the village, Amina went with her mother to the field. They worked side by side, and in the silence only the sound of the wind and birdsong disturbed their peace.
Mother, do you ever regret staying here?
Amina asked suddenly, mulling over Bucky's words. Naima stopped, looked up at her daughter, and replied, "No, my dear. I have found my home here, my place in this world. That is what is important to me. But you are different. You have always been different. I see your eyes light up when you talk about the world outside the village. I don't want you to live with regrets, but know that home will always be waiting for you wherever you go." These words of her mother had a profound effect on Amina. She realized that her mother saw and respected her dreams, even if she didn't share them herself. This gave her a sense of confidence and strength to one day make choices that would change her life. Although Amina continued to live her familiar life in the village, her thoughts increasingly turned to distant horizons. She felt that her time would come, and then she would take the first step towards her dream. The African village where the protagonist lives is located deep in the interior of the continent, far from major cities and modern roads. It is a place where time seems to stand still, where people live as their ancestors have lived for centuries. The village is surrounded by endless savannas, full of tall grass and rare trees that seem to watch over the locals. The houses in the village are made of clay and thatch, with roofs woven from palm leaves. These simple structures blend perfectly with nature and provide the inhabitants with protection from the scorching sun and occasional rains. Veitch House houses several generations of the same family: grandparents, parents, and children. Family ties are strong and sacred here, and each member of the family has a role to play in maintaining its well-being. The center of the village is a large square where all the important events take place. Festivals, markets, gatherings. Around the square are the most important buildings. The House of the Elder, the school where children learn literacy and basic crafts, as well as the chemist's shop crafts, and the hut of the witch doctor, who cures diseases with herbs and ancient rituals. Here, in this square, the villagers gather in the evenings to discuss news, swap stories and sing traditional songs to the accompaniment of drums. Tradition holds an important place in the life of the village. The villagers have a deep respect for the customs of their ancestors, passing them down from generation to generation. Every year, initiation rites are held for boys and girls, which symbolize the transition from childhood to adulthood. These rites, filled with deep meaning, help young people to understand their role in society and to strengthen their connection to their ancestors. Family rituals are an important part of village life. Here, it is still customary to arrange arranged marriages, where parents choose a future spouse for their children, a future husband or wife for their children. It's not just the consummation of a union between two people, but it also strengthens ties between families, clans. On the day of, the whole village gathers for a celebration accompanied by dancing and songs and lavish refreshments. Hospitality is another important trait of the villagers. Whether you're a local or a casual traveler, you will always be offered food and shelter. In the village, it is believed that a guest brings with them a blessing, so every house is open to visitors. The village lives according to its own rhythm, which is dictated by nature. The morning begins with the first rays of the sun, when the women go to the river for water, and the men go to the fields or to the forest to hunt. Children play outside the houses or help their elders with the chores. By midday, when the sun is at its zenith, stops for a while to rest from the unbearable heat. In the evening, when the village comes alive again, men return from work, women prepare dinner over an open fire, and the children gather to play traditional games. The nature around the village is teeming with life. There are acacia, baobab and acacias, baobabs and other trees that provide shade, and not far from the village there is a river which is a source of water and food for the villagers. The dark waters of the river hide fish, and its banks are home to a variety of animals, from small antelopes to large predators. The villagers know how to live in harmony with nature, respecting its laws and using its gifts with care. Relationships between villagers are based on mutual help and respect. Everyone here knows that in times of need, the support of their neighbors in times of need. Important decisions are made collectively, at council of elders, where everyone can express his or her opinion. This creates an atmosphere of unity and cohesion, where everyone feels part of a larger community. But despite the apparent idyll, the village has its own problems. Natural disasters such as droughts or floods can seriously disrupt the way of life. In times like these, the villagers come together even stronger to overcome the difficulties together. Also, as the world develops, more and more young people are leaving the village for a better life in the cities, which is alarming for the older generations. This African village is a world where ancient traditions and modern challenges intertwine, where people live in harmony with nature and each other. The protagonist of the story grew up here, absorbing from her mother's milk all the wisdom of her ancestors and her love for her homeland. But her life is about to change when she faces a difficult choice that puts her in a dilemma between tradition and modernity, between duty and personal feelings. The village where Amina lived was a close community, where everyone knew each other. Everyone here supported each other in times of need, and relationships between people were an important part of their daily lives. One day, a man came into their lives who was not a native of the village, but managed to gain the respect and trust of the villagers. This man's name was Idris. Was a middle-aged man with an open and kind face, thick black hair, in which the first strands of grey were beginning to appear. His eyes, deep and dark, radiated calm and wisdom. He was a friend of Naima, Amina's mother, and this man played an important role in the life of their family. He was a widower, having lost his wife years ago, and now lived alone, occasionally helping those who needed his support. He came to the village about 5 years ago and quickly became part of the local community. Idris was not only a family friend, but also a jack of all trades. He could fix anything from farm tools to the roof of a house. His knowledge and skills were valuable to the village, and residents often turned to him for help. He was respected for his hard work and generosity, as Idris never refused help and often worked for free if he saw that people were unable to pay. Idris met Naima the year he came to the village. At that time, she needed help with repairing her house after a severe thunderstorm, and Idris when he heard about it, offered his services. He spent several days helping to rebuild the roof and reinforce the walls. And at the same time, he became friends with Naima and her daughter. From then on, he became a frequent visitor to their home, and Naima trusted him as a close friend. He was a man who could be relied upon in any situation. Amina, observing their friendship, saw in Idris a figure similar to the father she had never known. His presence brought a sense of security and peace to the house, and he often brought with him not only practical help but also joy. He had a knack for telling stories that fascinated children and adults alike, and he often amused Amina with tales of his travels to different parts of the country. These stories awakened in the girl an even greater curiosity about the world outside the village. One evening, as the sun was beginning to set and a cool breeze pleasantly refreshed the streets, Idris went to Naima's house. Amina was preparing dinner, helping her mother by the hearth. When she heard his footsteps, she smiled, knowing that a visit from Idris always brought something good.
Good evening, Naima. Good evening, Amina.
Idris greeted them, walking into the house with a smile on his face.
Good evening, Idris.
Naima replied, smiling back.
Come on in, have a seat. We're just preparing dinner.
Idris took a seat by the hearth, watching Amina deftly stir the food in the earthenware. Her movements were confident despite her young age. Idris had always admired the way she had grown to become a true mistress of the house.
Amina, you are becoming a true craftswoman.
Idris praised her, and the girl was embarrassed by his words, but still couldn't help but smile.
Thank you, Idris, but I'm still learning a lot from my mother,
she replied, casting a quick glance at her mother, who seemed to nod approvingly.
The knowledge you are gaining here is invaluable,
Idris added.
You are no longer a girl, but a grown woman, and you grow wiser every day.
Amina didn't often hear words like that, and it made her feel good. She felt that Idris genuinely cared for her and her mother, and it gave her confidence. She knew she could trust him, just like her mother. Idris, though a frequent visitor to their home, never broke boundaries. He always came to respect their personal space, and always brought something useful with him. Fresh fruit, new tools, or just kind words. He helped not only with home repairs, but also with chores, if he saw that Naima needed help. His experience and knowledge often proved indispensable. Over time, Idris became almost a member of the family for Amina and Naima. He always supported them in difficult moments, helped them with advice and deeds. Whenever Amina had a question or a problem, she knew she could turn to Idris. He was a man who never left her unanswered, always trying to find the best way to help her. One day, when they were working together in the garden, Idris asked Amina a question she had been pondering for a long time.
Amina, have you ever thought about leaving the village and seeing the world?
Amina froze for a moment, then straightened up and looked at him.
I think about it a lot,
she admitted.
But I can't leave my mother alone. And then, the world outside the village seems so vast and frightening.
Idris, noticing her doubts, smiled softly.
It's true. The world is big and not always safe. But sometimes you have to take a step forward to realize who you are and what you want out of life,
he said as he bent down to pick a ripe fruit from a branch. Idris's words stayed with Amina for a long time. Although she was still young, she had a desire in her heart to know more, to see and experience something beyond her familiar world. Idris was like a guide to her, someone who could show her that the world was not limited to their village, and that she had the right to dream and find her own way. Over time, Idris became even closer to Naima and Amina's family. He not only helped them with their daily chores, but also became the person they turned to for advice on important life issues. He was a true friend who was always there when they needed his help. But despite his benevolence and support, Amina sometimes felt that Idris was hiding something in his heart. He was kind and generous, but there was a sadness in his eyes that he sometimes tried to hide. It did not leave the girl indifferent, and she often wondered what could have affected this strong man so much. One day, on one of the quiet evenings, when the three of them were sitting by the fire,
Idris, you often talk about the importance of following your path, but have you ever regretted anything in your life?
Idris looked at her, his eyes glittering in the firelight. He thought for a few moments before answering.
Each of us makes choices, Amina. Sometimes they are difficult, sometimes they lead to loss. I lost my wife, and it left a mark on my heart forever. But I don't regret choosing the path that brought me here, to this village, to you. Sometimes it's not what we gave up that matters, but what we gained.
These words sunk even deeper into Amina's heart. She realized that life is full of difficult choices and losses, but also gains. Idris, despite his pain, had found a new family and new meaning in his life. And this gave her the confidence that she too could find her path, whatever it might be. Time passed, and Idris continued to be an important part of their lives. He was not just a family friend, but a mentor to Amina, helping her grow and develop. He taught her not only crafts and skills, but also the wisdom that comes with experience. He was like a bridge for her between tradition and the new world she longed for. In the end, Amina realized that her journey had not yet begun, but she was ready for it thanks to the support of her mother and Idris. And perhaps one day she would take the step she dreamed of, but she knew that her home and her family would always be there for her wherever she was. Idris became increasingly present in the lives of Amina's family and her mother Naima, and his visits gradually became more than just friendly gatherings. He was not part of their family in the traditional sense, but his presence felt as if he was always with them. He became an important person in their lives, providing the support and help they sorely lacked after the loss of their husband and father. At first, his visits were occasional. Idris would come when he noticed that they needed help with hard work or when he saw that Naima was tired and needed support. He was a man who had a knack for noticing details and realizing when to intervene without violating the privacy of others. Gradually, these visits became regular, and soon the three of them were sitting around the hearth every evening, sharing the events of the previous day, discussing business and making plans for the future. Idris helped with everything, from repairing the house to harvesting the crops, from taking care of the livestock to solving household problems. His hands were always busy, and his head was full of useful advice. If Naima or Amina had a problem, they knew they could turn to Idris, and he would find a solution. He brought stability and confidence to their lives that they lacked. Over time, his role in the family grew. He became not just a friend, but a person to whom they could confide their deepest thoughts and worries. Naima, realizing this, relied more and more on his support. She felt that her life and her daughter's life were becoming easier and simpler around him. She knew that she could trust Idris, and this trust was gradually transferred to Amina as well. Amina, who initially saw Idris as just a family friend, began to see him as more than that over time. She noticed how their daily existence changed with his arrival. His help made their lives easier, and she realized that she had become attached to this man who seemed to understand her better than anyone else. Idris became someone who supported her dreams, even though he understood the importance of tradition and responsibilities to family. He taught Amina many things that were previously unknown to her. With him, she learned how to properly tend the fields, how to use new methods of growing plants that Idris had adopted in his travels to other regions. His knowledge and experience became a real treasure for her, which she valued and tried to absorb like a sponge. Idris never imposed his opinion, but always shared his experience when he saw that it could be useful. He respected their independence and tried to be helpful without intruding on their personal space. This was especially important to Amina, who was used to relying only on her mother and herself. She realized that Idris had come into their lives, not to change anything, but to help preserve and strengthen what they already had. Idris also cared for Naima as a loved one. He realized that she had taken on a great responsibility, raising her daughter alone, and tried to lighten her burden At times, he took over the chores that were too heavy for her. He was always there when Naima needed support, whether it was physical help or just a kind word. Naima, seeing how Idris cared for them, trusted him more and more. She felt that he truly cared about her and Amina's well-being, and that trust grew stronger every day. They began to discuss everything with him, from everyday concerns to future plans. Naima valued his opinion and often asked his advice, knowing that he would always give her an honest and informed answer. For Amina, Idris became not only a helper in business, but also a mentor. He would tell her about the world outside the village, sharing his memories and the knowledge he had gained elsewhere. These stories further fueled her dreams and desires to see the world beyond her familiar surroundings. Idris spoke to her not as a child, but as an equal, respecting her opinions and interests. This caused Amina to develop a deep sympathy for him and built her trust. As she worked in the fields or did chores around the house, she found herself thinking more and more of Idris's advice, and that his words helped her to cope with her difficulties. She realized that his presence in their lives had become natural, as if he had always been a part of their family. His help made her feel more confident and capable of doing more. Another important change that Amina noticed had to do with her mother. With the arrival of Idris, Naima became calmer and more confident. She no longer looked as tired and anxious as she used to. There was hope in her eyes and faith in the future. Naima often told Amina how important it was to have someone to trust, and Amina saw that Idris had become that person for her mother. The months passed, and with each passing day, Idris became more and more a part of their lives. He brought to the house a sense of warmth and security that they had long lost with the departure of their husband and father. Although they did not talk about it openly, both Amina and Naima realized that Idris had become more than just a friend to them. He was the person they could count on at any moment, who never left them in times of need and was always there for them when they needed him. Idris, for his part, also found something he missed in their family. He, who had lost his wife, found in Naima and Amina a new family that accepted him with an open heart. He knew that to them his help was valuable, and it gave him a sense of belonging and significance. He felt that his life was making sense again, that he could be useful and needed. This bonding did not happen overnight, but over time they all realized that they had become a real family, even if not related by blood. This new union brought them all the joy and peace they had been missing in their lives. Though the future was uncertain, they knew that with Idris they had a support and a backbone to rely on in any situation. With each passing day, their bond grew stronger, and Idris became not just a friend, but an important part of Amina and Naima's lives, someone they could no longer imagine being without.
Amina, an 11-year-old girl
From a small African village, could never have imagined that her life would change so suddenly and dramatically. Until recently, she had been full of dreams for the future, eager to expand her horizons and explore the world beyond her village. Her days were filled with chores around the house, studying, and hoping for a brighter future. She was intelligent and sagacious, truly believing that her life would be fulfilling and full of possibilities. But all of that changed in an instant. It all started when Naima, Amina's mother, developed health difficulties. This was an unexpected and painful turn of events. Amina, feeling responsible, tried to help her mother in every possible way, and Idris, who was always at her side, proved to be an invaluable support. He helped with the household chores, tended the fields, and took care of the farm, while Amina was busy taking care of Naima. Idris, despite all the difficulties, remained an important part of their lives. His presence seemed to bring comfort and a sense of security, but at the same time an unusual closeness was beginning to emerge in his relationship with Amina. It was hard to explain. It was the kind of closeness that was hard to define in words, but felt physically and emotionally. Amina couldn't fully understand her feelings and sensations, and it began to disturb her. Gradually, Amina noticed that her body had changed. At first, it was minor signs: fatigue, headaches, strange sensations in her stomach. She tried not to pay much attention to it, thinking that it was all the result of stress and overwork. But soon the symptoms became more pronounced. Her condition worsened, and she felt increasingly nauseous, weak and dizzy. With each passing day, her doubts and fears only grew. Amina realized that her body was changing, and deep down she knew it couldn't be due to anything normal. Her anxiety grew, and each day she felt more and more anxious and unsure. She tried to explain it to herself as something temporary, hoping it would go away on its own. But there was already an anxiety brewing in her heart that was impossible to ignore. When Naima came to know about her daughter's condition, she was shocked. At first, she couldn't understand what was going on, but soon she too began to suspect that something serious was happening to Amina. They went to a local witch doctor who, after an examination and a few questions, confirmed what Amina feared most. She was pregnant. This news came as a real blow to the family. Amina was silent and depressed. She felt the world crumbling around her. Her fear was overwhelming. She didn't know how to handle the situation, and her future seemed vague and uncertain. Pregnancy meant not only physical changes, but also huge social and emotional implications. She knew that her life would now be completely different, and this was hard to accept. Amina felt a deep sense of shame and guilt. She felt that she had let her mother down, shattered her dreams, and destroyed everything that had been built up to this point. In a village where tradition and public opinion mattered a lot, this situation could lead to judgment and isolation. She knew that her future would now be determined not only by her decisions, but also by the reactions of those around her. This thought was overwhelming and frightened her even more. Amina's inner state was heightened. She felt like her body and mind were being torn apart by stress. Her emotional state was compromised. She often experienced tears, confusion, and a deep sense of uncertainty. Her mind was spinning with thoughts of how things could have gone differently, that if she could have made a difference, she would have. But it was all useless thinking. She was in a situation from which there was no easy way out. Amina felt lonely and isolated. Even though Idris continued to be close to her, she couldn't reveal the depth of her emotions to him. In her eyes, he remained a close friend, someone she trusted. But now that trust was also accompanied by fear of what had happened. She realized that she and Idris could no longer put things back the way they were, no matter how hard they tried. Her worries and fears were too great to ignore. Every day was becoming a challenge for Amina. She tried to remain outwardly calm, but a storm of emotions raged inside her. There was no way for her to escape the consequences of what had happened, and she knew she was in for a rough ride. This pregnancy was not just a physiological condition, but a serious test of her spirit, social identity, and life plans. Her focus was now on how to cope with this new phase of life, how to keep her family and her reputation intact, and how to adapt to the new realities. Amina felt that her world had changed forever, and she had to find a way to live with this new knowledge and the new challenges that faced her. Amina was deep in thought about what had happened. From the moment she learned of her pregnancy, her life had changed beyond recognition. Her brain was constantly working, trying to comprehend and accept this new reality. She experienced a spectrum of emotions ranging from deep fear to boundless confusion. These feelings were constantly intertwined, forming a complex tangle that she could not untangle. Every morning when she woke up, Amina felt her heart clench at the thought that her future was now unknown. Earlier she had dreamed of an independent life, education and career, but now all these dreams seemed out of reach. Pregnancy brought with it a whole new set of responsibilities and demands, and she realized that these changes would alter her life forever. In her mind sat the fear of possible repercussions and resentment from the community. The village she lived in had strict traditions and norms. Every violation of social order was perceived extremely negatively. Amina was well aware of what the public opinion of her situation would be. She knew that her reputation would be jeopardized, and this filled her inner world with anxiety and fear. The thought of having her name associated with such disgrace, this fear was so deep that she felt it physically, like a heavy burden that clutched her chest and prevented her from breathing easy. Amina's inner conflict was heightened and complex. On the one hand, she felt a deep sense of obligation to her family. Nima, her mother, had already endured many hardships, and Amina realized that she could not let her mother suffer because of her. She felt that her actions could have serious consequences for Naima's health and well-being. The thought that her mother might be worried about her was unbearable. Amina knew that her actions would now affect not only herself, but everyone she cared about. This realization added to her fear and confusion. Her inner conflict was compounded by the fact that she didn't know what the right thing to do in the situation was. Deciding how to handle the pregnancy required more from her than just being physically ready. She needed to make a moral decision that would affect her life and her mother's life. On the other hand, the fear of the future and the possible consequences was so great that it sometimes overwhelmed her ability to think soberly. Amina could not see clearly how she would be able to cope with the challenges that faced her. The financial strain of having a child was one of the major challenges. She realized that caring for a newborn would require significant resources that they did not have. The mere thought of how they would be able to cope with this financial burden. Amina was also worried about her personal freedom. Previously, she had envisioned a life in which she could develop her talents and achieve the goals she had set for herself. But now her future seemed unpredictable and limited to her. Every morning when she woke up, her thoughts returned to the question of how she would be able to cope with this new phase of life without losing herself and her dreams. Psychologically, she experienced constant tension. Throughout the day, Amina tried to hide her feelings from others, especially her mother. She did not want to add unnecessary worry and stress to Naima, knowing that her mother was already experiencing enough difficulties. She often felt that she had to stay strong and keep her outward composure, even when her insides were crackling with tension and fear. Often in her thoughts were thoughts of how she would deal with public opinion. Amina realized that society would judge her harshly, and this judgment could ruin her life. She feared that her life would be marked by shame and condemnation, and that she would have to face negative consequences that could linger for years to come. Her fear of the future was also heightened by the lack of a clear plan. Amina did not know how to proceed properly or what steps to take to improve her situation. She felt that all the decisions she had to make would have long-term consequences, and this realization only exacerbated her fears and doubts. In this situation, she also felt fear about how her personal life would change. Her thoughts often conjured up images of a future in which she could not realize her dreams and ambitions, replaced by the daily routine and care of a child. This brought an additional sense of uncertainty and anxiety into her life. The constant worry and internal conflict led Amina to often feel exhausted and devastated. She tried to find a way out of the situation, but her fears and insecurities prevented her from seeing possible solutions. These emotions and thoughts mixed together to create a huge chaos in her mind, from which it was difficult for her to get out. Thus, Amina's inner world was full of doubts, fears, and deep thoughts about the future. She realized that her life would change forever, and she had to find a way to cope with this new reality, despite all the difficulties and uncertainties. Amina knew that her decision to tell her mother about her pregnancy was inevitable. Her internal conflict had become so intense that she could no longer hide the truth. The unknown and fear of Naima's reaction tormented her. Amina knew that she needed to be honest with her mother to at least try to find a solution and deal with the situation. She also knew that this move would have serious consequences, both for her mother. The days dragged on, and the internal pressure on Amina grew. Every day she tried to find the right moment and the right words, but each time fear and doubt took over. Her mind was filled with thoughts of how Naima would react. She was afraid that her mother would not forgive her, that she would be judged, and that it would lead to more hardship for their family. One day, when Naima weakly got out of bed after her illness and was feeling a little better, Amina decided that it was the right moment. They sat down to dinner, and although Amina tried to remain calm, her heart was beating at a frantic pace. Dinner was silent, and every bite of food seemed as heavy as a stone. Amina gathered her wits, and finally she made a decision. When they were alone, Amina approached her mother, her hands trembling and the words coming out of her mouth hard. The words "Mom, I'm pregnant" hung in the air like a heavy burden. Naima looked at her daughter with horror and incomprehension. Her eyes read pain, and she hardly realized what she had heard. This moment was like a blow to the head, and Naima's reaction was full of complex emotions. Naima could not immediately believe what she had heard. She froze, her face turned pale, and she struggled to find words. The sense of betrayal and pain was obvious, and Naima was stunned and overwhelmed with emotion. She didn't know how to react, and her inner world was full of conflicting feelings. Naima was overwhelmed and needed time to comprehend. And after the initial shock passed, Naima began to realize that she needed to find a way to cope with the situation. Despite her pain, she realized that Amina needed support and could not leave her alone. At first, Naima was furious and frustrated, but soon her feelings transformed into a deep concern and desire to help her daughter cope with the aftermath. She realized that her own feelings should not overshadow Amina's needs. In the village, the news spread quickly, and the public reaction was expectedly harsh. In a traditional society where every act counts, condemnation and gossip did not last long. Amina became the subject of discussion, and neighbors and family friends, upon learning of her pregnancy, began to voice their displeasure and condemnation. This reaction was painful and difficult to accept. She realized that her actions caused negative reactions, and this added to her stress and anxiety. However, not all of the villagers were negative. Some, especially those who knew Amina and her family, showed support and compassion. These people realized that Amina was not the sole perpetrator of the situation and that she needed to be helped to cope. They offered their help, whether it was material support or moral encouragement. This support was like a ray of light in a dark night for Amina, helping her to keep hope and confidence that not everyone around her was against her. Naima, seeing this reaction from some of the villagers, began to feel that her daughter could find support and encouragement in the current situation. She realized that at least a part of the community was willing to help them through this ordeal. This relieved her of some of the burden, and she began to look for ways to organize support for Amina. Criticism from neighbors and acquaintances was not only painful, but also disrupted the stability of the family. Naima and Amina tried to stay together, but each day the outside pressures grew stronger. Internal conflicts and social stigma made their daily lives more difficult. These difficulties created additional obstacles and challenges for them to cope with. Amina felt that her life would be forever changed. She had to cope with societal pressures as well as internal worries and fears. Her feelings were mixed, ranging from shame and guilt to a desire to make things right and move forward. Each day was a struggle to maintain her dignity and gain understanding and support. Along with how Amina and Naima coped, they also began to adjust to their new circumstances. Although their lives were difficult, they began to realize that their relationships and family support became important factors in coping. Amina began to learn to accept and recognize the consequences of her actions, and Naima, although deeply distressed, tried to provide her daughter with the support she needed. These experiences and challenging moments became part of their lives, and although they were full of difficulties, they also helped them see how important it was to stay connected and support each other. In these trials, they found the strength to carry on and the will to deal with the situation, no matter how difficult it seemed. When Amy realized that her life had changed forever, she was faced with making an important decision about her and her child's future. The situation was complex and multi-layered, requiring her clarity of thought and maturity. The public reaction was brutal, and the internal conflict caused by her pregnancy deeply affected her soul. Amina realized that her actions would determine not only her own fate, but also the future of her child. From the moment Amina revealed her secret to her mother, her life and that of her family changed. Naima, despite her initial pain and disappointment, became supportive of her daughter, and together they began to plan the next steps. It was not easy at first, and each week brought new challenges and difficulties. The surrounding community continued to judge and whisper, which created additional tension. However, partial support from some of the villagers helped the family cope. Amina realized that she had a decision to make about the baby and her future. Pregnancy was not only a physical challenge, but also a serious moral and social challenge. With each passing day, her thoughts about the future became clearer, and she began to realize that her choices had to be based on her own wants and needs as well as the care of the baby. She chose to keep the baby, despite difficult circumstances. This choice was not an easy one, but Amina felt that it was the most appropriate decision in her situation. Her inner decision had to do with giving the child a chance at life, as well as finding a way to secure her child's future. In keeping the baby, Amina knew she would face many challenges. The financial situation remained tight, and she realized that she would have to work to provide for her family. Naima also made the decision to help her daughter through this difficult process, despite her own limitations and difficulties. They began looking for ways to gain support from villagers and local organizations to minimize financial hardship. These efforts included help from those who were willing to offer material or moral support. They sought help from village organizations that could offer assistance to large families and those in need. Over time, Amina adapted to her new role as a mother and began to develop the skills needed to care for her child. She continued to work in the fields, where she could and looked for opportunities for additional income to provide for her family. These efforts were strenuous, but they also helped her realize her own strengths and capabilities. Amina tried to keep her dreams and aspirations alive despite new challenges. Society's attitudes also began to change. Over time, despite initial condemnation, some villagers began to see that Amina and her family were working to improve their situation. Gradually, more positive views of their difficulties and efforts began to form among the people. This change in perception was an important step toward acceptance and support for Amina and her family. They began to feel that society was beginning to recognize their efforts and fight prejudice. The role of tradition in Amina's life also underwent a change. At first, traditions and norms seemed immutable and strict, but over time, they began to adapt to the new environment. Amina and her mother began to realize that tradition does not always have to define their lives, and that sometimes a balance between tradition and individual needs must be sought. They began to support new forms of help and solidarity that helped them cope. Amina also realized that her role in society was now changing. She became a symbol of struggle and perseverance, and her story inspired some people in the village. This new perception brought new opportunities and support into her life. She began to see her situation as a chance to change her destiny and show others that it is possible to overcome challenges despite preconceptions. As a result, Amina was able to find the strength and support to face the challenges she faced. She embraced her role as a mother and actively worked to improve her life and the life of her child. Although her journey was full of hardships, she learned to cope and find joy in the little things. Her story has become an example of how to face challenges, adapt to new environments, and seek support in difficult times. Amina also became involved in her village, helping others and promoting change in perceptions and support for women in difficult situations. She realized that her experience could help others and that her story could be a lesson for future generations. This process of change in society was slow, but Amina was determined to do what she could to make her life and her child's life better. Thus, the conclusion of Amina's story is related to her inner transformation and change in her attitude towards life. She accepted her new situation and started to build her life anew. Despite all the difficulties and biases, her journey was not easy, but her determination and perseverance allowed her to face the challenges and find a way to adapt to the new reality. Her story was a testament to her fortitude and ability to overcome difficulties, inspiring others to follow her example.